Praise of Folly. Welcome to Lambster 2024. Are you ready to face the gauntlet?
I
am. All right. So, for a reminder for people, or maybe this is the first one I put up on the channel. The theme is it's like a medieval tournament. Every contestant gets 5 rounds to prove themselves, and the rounds consist of a series of opinions, which they will have to either agree or disagree with, and then I'll give them a score. So, Praise of Folly, you will get a score after every round out of 5, and then I'll total them up, and then maybe I'll even make a leaderboard. So, let me share this. Are you ready for round number 1?
I am.
So, a smaller government is always better. The government should run standardized testing for children, or pharmaceutical companies should be strictly regulated. Let me read them again. A smaller government is always better. The government should run standardized testing for children, or pharmaceutical companies should be strictly regulated. So first question is, which of those 3 opinions would you like to discuss? And then I'll ask you if you want to take the affirmative or the oppositional.
Pharmaceutical companies should be strictly regulated.
Great. And are you going to be agreeing or disagreeing with that statement?
Agreeing.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and just give me? By the way, the guests have not seen the questions in advance, so this is off the top of your head. Do you want to just give me a couple of minutes of your immediate thoughts in favor of pharmaceutical companies should be strictly regulated?
Right. So I think I'll open up with a reference to the Farscape cartoon where there's a man writing on a chalkboard, "A patient cured is a customer lost." So the pharmaceutical companies in the modern United States have a built-in incentive structure to keep you sick. Because if you're sick, they don't want you dead. Because if you're dead, you can't buy any more of their products. But they want to keep you sick. So
sounds like a host and a like a parasite biologically.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And so, well, on the one hand, right, medicine is itself a good, and health is a good. The real question is, the pharmaceutical industry, medicine and health conducive? I'd argue it's not, for a whole host of reasons. And they work with other elements of the American economy to ensure that we remain sick. So what are some of the things we take drugs for? Well, mental health, right? That's one. Another thing we might take drugs for is SSRIs for obesity and weight-related issues. Okay, let's look at those 2. Well, let's start with the last one, the weight-related issues. Well, where did all of this come from? Well, it comes from seed oils. Since 1913, we've been eating the equivalent of industrial lubricant in our foods. Cottonseed oil was a byproduct of the cotton ginning process, which Procter & Gamble, when they created Crisco, utilized in order to repackage as a substitute for lard and tallow, which were the previous frying animal fats. And so what ends up happening then is it creates previously unknown human health issues that eating animal fats would not have caused, which then creates a need for some sort of medical or pharmaceutical treatment, which, that's where a lot of this comes from. But then it's this feedback loop where they support food industries to continue to keep this in our food, which keeps us sick. But it also is a moral hazard for bad behavior, where even if you're not entirely aware of the ins and the outs of what goes into our food, we all know that some food is better than other food. And we all know that eating too much is not good. But, with these pharmaceuticals, you can sort of manage the negative costs, at least on yourself. But that doesn't necessarily follow to those around you. I mean, if you have a reduced capacity to act or think, then those around you are still going to suffer from your ill choices that the pharmaceutical companies allow you to do. The other thing would be, again, stress, right? Dealing with stress issues. Part of it is individual choices that are made, right? So rather than thinking, maybe I'm making the wrong decisions in life, maybe always getting into fights with people is not good for my mental health, you just take pills. On a more, no, that's something you can actually deal with. On a more nefarious level, modern society itself is inherently stress-inducing in a way that earlier iterations of human society were not. And this becomes a kind of like safety valve to ensure that people don't just, go postal because they can't handle the stress or the tension. And then most obviously is you have the recent COVID experience where pharmaceutical companies basically rushed through an untested process that didn't even meet full recommendations of government oversight testing. Which, whatever you think about what was in the COVID experimental vaccine therapy, gene therapy, or not, this is a highly unusual and highly suspicious treatment of where you just rush it out and you ignore the testing. And so there's all sorts of moral hazards, all sorts of terrible motivations that pharmaceutical companies have, and they generally contribute to sickness rather than to health. So therefore, I would argue because of all those reasons, pharmaceutical companies should be strictly regulated.
Okay, well, to a degree, you're singing to the choir because I share a lot of your trepidations around pharmaceutical companies. The thing I'd like to dig into a bit is whether regulation is actually the solution. So I'd argue that in many cases, the regulation that gets passed is the exact regulation that the pharmaceutical companies have lobbied to create, and it actually ends up being in their interests. So you end up making a bad situation even worse.
Well, right, in the United States, but let's look at Europe, right? For example, when it comes to additives in food or chemicals or anything like that, they tend to have better results. Or even just recently, I saw on Twitter, Dave and Sargon were saying, "Oh, you can go to Europe and eat whatever you want, and your health and your body weight doesn't change much. In America, it's poisoned." Right, but you see, there are regulations in Europe into what you can do with food, and they seem to be working. And people can seem to go to Europe and not really pay too much attention to what they eat without worrying about deleterious consequences. Part of it is what makes Europe different than America is that Europe has, in some cases, nationalities, states that are 1,000 years old or more, along with religious and cultural institutions, which have a built-in limiting factor on what a corporation might do. Whereas in America, because it's a relatively young nation and doesn't have these deep roots, it's easier for that interest because it's qualitatively stronger at the present, and there isn't this inertial presence of an old nation or an old state or an old church like in Europe to contain it. It's able to capture these regulatory agencies and then work it around. But we do seem to have better results in Europe as to these sorts of things.
I've heard the speculation that I'm wondering how much YouTube will like this discussion, but the reason that so they developed this particular technology, right? The technology that was used for the COVID jabs, the technology had not really been used that much, and there were kind of secretly known issues with it, and the issues were sufficient that they would probably not be able to make that much money if they were to follow the normal procedures. So the advantage of having a pandemic was that it actually meant suddenly suddenly all of the normal checks and balances were removed because we're in an emergency. This is an emergency authorized medicine, and so you are no longer held liable if people get injured because of this medicine that you've developed. You're completely indemnified. So I guess I don't know how that plays into this question on one side or the other, except to say that the regulation doesn't seem to be that much of a factor. It's about power, and the pharmaceutical companies seem to be sufficiently powerful that the regulation is is ineffective. So I guess to turn that into a question, how would you more strictly regulate in the US in that situation where they've got the stranglehold, and they seem to be able to, like Aikido, twist any attempts to regulate them back into their own favor?
I mean, part of the problem is, these conglomerates are so large and powerful. Like you said, they exert so much influence. It's been a very long time since the Sherman Antitrust Act has been used, but I think it's long overdue. I mean, because when we talk about regulation, a lot of times it's sort of portrayed as like a slap on the wrist. Like, okay, you're going to have all these procedures, and you can't do this, you can't do this, but you can do that. You can't do this, but you can do that. And, that's easy to observe and to get around. But like if you're actually broken up, and then the sort of inertia behind any given institution is sufficiently weak that it can't countervail other things, it could in theory work. But we haven't seen that for a while.
Great. Okay, let's call an end to round one, and I'm going to give you a 4 out of 5 because I thought it was a very strong performance. You brought lots of relevant cases and instances. You made a persuasive case. I think I was largely on side with you, but if anything, you did swing my opinion in your direction. So I'll give you a 4 out of 5, and we'll go on to the next round. Here are your 3 new questions to consider. Taxation is a necessary evil. Laws should evolve with culture. Or society cannot be secular. Let me read them again. Taxation is a necessary evil. Laws should evolve with culture. Or society cannot be secular. Which of the three opinions would you like to tackle?
Society cannot be secular. In favor.
You're arguing in favor of that. So take it away.
Right. So one of the really important articles that swung my opinion in this way was The Empty Shrine by William T. Kavanaugh, who argued that American imperialism, which he rooted in all of these corporate interests, sort of creates this facade that there is no God being worshipped. And he mentions that throughout, the ancient world, whether it was Egypt or Babylon or Rome or the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church, the powers that be always had some sort of appeal to the divine or to the religious, that they said, look at this temple, look at this place of worship, and then we are the protectors and guarantors of this worship. And the secular society says, well, no, we can all worship our gods, and we don't have to fight each other doing that. And he says, well, no, you can't really do it that way. It doesn't work. There's still something there. And in this case, it would be, the demand for profits and consumerism, things like that, right? You also just have the logical impossibility of having all of these contending beliefs. The only way that they can be considered equal or contending is by devaluing them to something that's not really meaningful, something that's, a personal accessory. But then the other question too, though, is what is secular? I mean, that's in the aughts, New Atheism claimed to be the representation of secular culture. They were maybe a more militant strain because they didn't just want religion not to be in control. They didn't want it present at all in the public discourse. But whatever you appeal to in order to have this civil society is serving the role of a religion, in the sense that you're going to have practice and some sort of catechism where you learn the proper way to behave and all of these things. And a good example would be like the Soviet Union, right? We're like, well, it didn't really replace God with nothing. It replaced God with the state. It replaced God with the historical dialectic. And if you didn't believe in any of those, then, you'd be in big trouble. It wasn't really secular in the sense that we want secular to be a meaningful concept. And so the real question is rather not, can society be secular? But really, what kind of religious position is the society going to uphold? And so we can see now with like the woke, right? If you burn the rainbow flag, as you'll get into a lot of trouble in the way that you might have gotten in trouble in the past for burning the American flag, like in the 50s. So there's still something there.
So, I again, I tend to come into this question heartily agreeing. But I was just wondering, could you say that secularism is the pretense of having a disestablished state, or it's the hiding of the true religiosity of the culture? Or you could say something like, a secular society is when there is no dominant, or there is a transitional moment between two religions. So could you? I mean, is there a meaning of this term secular that could we should be able to distinguish? I mean, let's remember in Acts, what is it, 14? Where no, Acts. Anyway, up on Mars Hill, Paul looks around and says, "Well, I see you are a very religious people." He's referring to the fact that in Athens they had endless statues that people would bow to. There's kind of a religiosity, an open devoutness towards spiritual matters. So surely we should be able to have a word that describes the opposite.
I mean, we can talk about this in a sort of abstract conceptual level. But one of the things that Ed Feser points out in his criticisms of libertarianism for pretending to offer such a nice, neat, secular solution is that whenever you begin to explain it in some sort of more robust, practical application way, rather than just pure abstract theory, it ends up looking a lot more like a left-wing or a right-wing kind of thing, depending on the speaker. And then, you further narrow that down because the speaker has other priors that inform what he views as neutral or secular. And so it's sort of like the pretense of, objective facts, and the idea that, like, in the scientific world, they're like, oh, well, these are just, facts without any sort of bias or assumption. It's you religious people that have all that, when in fact they're just as much laden with all that as well.
It's Act 17, by the way. I just looked it up. Was what I was referencing. So, would you say that you cannot measure how secular a society is?
Well, again, this is how does one want to define secular? Now, again, in the general sense, secular means, at least in the West, this idea that we have this open discussion where all religions and all philosophies are equally represented, and in theory, right? And that no one of them is dominant in theory. But in practice, what that actually means is they're just all reduced to, personal accoutrements that you just wear, like a handbag or a hat, and they don't really represent anything. And what they all represent is this sort of spirit of benevolent liberalism, right? That's what it amounted to. And it's not so much that we had actually discrete, distinct positions, but a movement that was a religion or a spirit that was manifesting itself in the garb of other religions in order to make the appearance of different people sitting at the same table, when they were really all the same people, because they were all the liberal elements of all these different religions sitting at the table.
All right. I think we're going to call this round here, unless you have any last words on the topic.
No, I think we're good.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a 3 for that round, because I think you did a good job, but I did already come into the topic largely agreeing. So you didn't persuade me further into the cause. All right. Here is your round 3. Mainstream news should be avoided. Globalism is positive, or Marx was right.
Okay, we're going in for the spicy one. Marx was right.
I was hoping you'd say that. Which side of the argument are you taking?
I'm going to take the affirmative here.
The affirmative. Go ahead.
Okay, so now we need to qualify right. That's a very open-ended statement. So with regards to two things, his description of the capitalist power structure and then its negative effects on society, but specifically the negative effects that it has on society with regards to traditional values. So there's this idea which Marx inherits from Thomas Carlyle called the cash nexus, where all forms of human social interaction are mediated by a cash exchange, which both bemoan, but for somewhat different reasons. They both agree that this is a ratchet effect, which gives the moneyed interests more and more power over society in defining how one ought to conduct oneself and determining how the Overton window, to use a modern terminology, is to be framed. And what ends up happening is, the values of the aristocracy, the old aristocracy, the values of the church, the values of traditional concepts are all subtly eroded, because in order to gain resources from other human beings, you have to engage in the cash nexus. None of those things in principle have a commodity cash value. So in order to survive and interacting with other humans in a social arrangement, you just shed those in order to get more of the resources you need by adopting this new mentality that is more commercial oriented. And this, of course, erodes the idea of community, tradition, so on and so on. The other thing that many in this circle are concerned about is immigration. Not just illegal immigration, but immigration as such, especially the unrestrained levels we've seen since the 1960s. Okay, well, what is the mechanism by which this happens? Well, we have a class of people that own the means of production. They're called the bourgeoisie. They own factories, mines, property, railways, and through financial coercion, even the government. The Federal Reserve Bank, of course, is where the government draws a lot of revenue for lending and for generating revenue to fight wars or to have government services, which gives them a significant amount of control over the government. Now, what's their goal? Their goal is to keep labor as cheap as possible. And the best way to reduce the cost of labor is increasing the number of laborers. Hence, the idea of importing immigrants into a country. Now, in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, in his 1882 preface to the Russians, says that, America is basically a country of small landholders, which are farmers, and tradesmen and craftsmen, and their country is being overrun by, in his day, European immigrants, because it was a vast untapped labor market in a relatively sparsely populated continent, which would ultimately lead to the creation of large economic combines that would destroy the original population of America. Almost like what we're dealing with right now. Very interesting. And then one more point. The other point is, when we look at, commodification, that's the other thing. So labor is now commodified. So a commodity is defined as that which is produced to be exchanged for a commodity for another commodity. So whereas, let's look at a village community, right? You didn't produce goods to be sold in a global market. You didn't produce goods to be exchanged for other commodities. Now, at a certain point, you might have the father who brought in the crops, go to the town to sell it. So some of the economic production, you could argue, was for commodities, but a lot of the economic production was just for social use, for use within the community, to feed everybody, to clothe everybody. And this was done based on complex relationships of kinship groups, the ideas of religious obligation, and a lot of that economic activity just wasn't transactional in the sense that, well, what are you going to give me in favor? Classic example of this, right? We look at the boomers and the Xers who learned a lot of useful skills that allow them to operate in a market economy and make money, and the millennials and Zoomers didn't. And the problem is, well, we have to, if they're going to teach it to us, we're going to have to pay them. But you see, the problem is we can't pay them because they have all the money, they have all the property, they got it before we did. And so now it's like there's a transfer of information break. And that's going to necessarily happen if the only way you view other people is an exchange of commodities. So I like to give this example. In a Native American tribe, no one would envision, the brave telling his son, well, I'm not going to teach you how to hunt with a bow and arrow until you can already pay me in deer meat. Well, no, that's stupid. The kid can't do it yet. He'd never learn. You have to literally sink the time in for him to learn before he can even give you any returns or dividends. But because of the commodity system, this entire thing breaks down. And now we have this gap that's growing between millennials and Zoomers. And it's not just a gap, and boomers and Xers. It's not just a gap of wealth inequality. It's a gap of a skill shortfall where the skills aren't being propagated. So the next generation just isn't going to have those skills, which will snowball effect for collapse.
I wonder if we could divide Marx's thought into three categories. One is descriptive, and I think that's his strongest suite. He made some quite interesting and apt observations about the way the world is. But then he also has normative and predictive perspective. So he advocates for things, and he also thinks that things are inevitable, that there's no avoiding. History is just moving in this direction. And I think a lot of the things that he advocates for and a lot of the things that he predicted are weak or straight up wrong. And in some cases, as history has passed, he predicted, correct me if I'm wrong, the middle class would grow to a point where they would become dominant and seize control. And although he was right to a degree that the middle class has grown, it's not, I'd argue, has not taken power. In fact, the middle class might be the oppressed minority at this point. That the people who are ruling don't, although they claim to represent the interests of the middle class, in fact, the situation is that the power hierarchy is not constituted that much differently from how it was when Marx was writing. So do you want to start by addressing his prediction of the, well, he would have said the working world unite, I suppose.
Okay, so a couple of things here. I'll go with the three divisions. I mean, the normative claims, or sorry, the descriptive claims, I think are where he's right. The normative claims, I think, are where he's wrong. I mean, I don't believe in historical dialectic. I don't believe in historical necessity. In fact, World War I kind of shattered a lot of Marxist views about the future of things. And the solutions that, well, okay, so this is where I think you're not quite right. Marx predicted, as far as I can tell, that not that the middle class would grow, but that everybody would become slaving proletariats because of how the capitalist structure was set up. And then because of that, that would lead eventually to a proletarian revolution in the industrialized world, like Germany or England or something like that. Now, the reason that didn't happen in the West was in part because of reforms that took place, economic reforms, which have subsequently been rolled back. So maybe that prediction has not yet been proven false.
So the reforms you're saying, so this kind of workers' rights, the rise of unions, was a dampening factor to the unrest that Marx predicted and actually prevented the proletariat revolution.
Right.
But because the reforms have been rolled back, the revolution might still happen.
Right. Because what ends up happening is that, I don't know, probably sometime in the FDR era, right? Unions get rather strong. A lot of the good times that people remember from the 50s were the result of a lot of these economic arrangements that had developed. And so the worst excesses of these corporations were not allowed. But, we've seen that a lot of that rolled back since Reagan, and increasingly conditions are reverting to what they were in the 1880s. So with almost no end in sight. So we'll see.
I've lost your audio. Just
Can you hear me?
oh yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, good.
Carry on.
Oh, did you hear what I said, or do I need to restate it?
Yeah, restate it because your audio dropped out almost as soon as you started speaking.
Okay, so as to so the union under the FDR era, largely speaking, the unions were able to, along with I guess you could say supporters of the liberal establishment, check the worst excesses of capitalism so that the wages of workers were not completely devastated. And one of those aspects was restrictions on immigration, right? Because unions historically were in favor of immigration restrictions, which is one way to keep the price of labor up, is keeping the supply down.
Mm-hmm.
But then after the Reagan era, that's all been cut away, and it's like there just seems to be no end in sight to this trajectory. In which case, I maybe I used to be like everyone else. Oh yeah, 1991 proved that the predictions were false. But like in part, the West hedged, but then it stopped hedging. So maybe it will still happen. It's hard to tell now.
I guess it's one of those predictions that until it happens, we don't know. When it does happen, then the people predicting it can say they were definitely correct. But
Right.
if you can just put it off indefinitely, I mean, the increase in the availability of luxury goods seems to be a way to pacify people as well. So you can just try to measure and do little tests, figure out whether or not people are going to revolt, and maybe the powerful have got it down to such a fine art that they are now in a completely secure castle. But yeah. All right. Let's call an end to the round. I just wanted to. So you're saying that you're not defending his normative claims.
No, I'm defending his descriptive claims.
Fine. Okay. In that case, I have to give you a 4.5, which makes me realize I should have picked a scoring system out of 10 instead of endlessly subdividing. But yeah, I think you did an excellent job. I was not immediately on board with you, and I thought you made some very powerful and convincing arguments there. So I'm going to chalk you up almost the highest possible score. And let's have a look at the next round. Scripture is inerrant. Rational thinking is overrated. Or there is no role for skepticism in the life of faith. So your options again: Scripture is inerrant. Rational thinking is overrated. Or there is no role for skepticism in the life of faith.
Okay, we're gonna go for another spicy one. Rational thinking is overrated. Agree.
Okay.
So we're gonna go into it.
Go ahead.
So one of this general concept is downstream from the Enlightenment, and that man's reason can be used to exhaustively understand the universe and everything in it. Which, on the one hand, if you like it, has led to the scientific revolution, which is a great thing. If you don't like it, it's a terrible thing. But what it has ended up leading us to is an idea that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And so rational thinking has been now evolved into this shibboleth where you ignore that the other half of the universe exists. There was a sort of revolt against that with Romanticism, but you could argue that that went in too far in the other direction in favor of, say, feelings and intuitions. Now, let's make the case. So let's look at, I guess, when you think of rational thinking as a means of knowing something, we could think of feeling as the opposite way of knowing something. So one of my favorite examples is, let's say we have two experienced woodsmen in the wild. And then, but there's one who has what we might call like a sixth sense, or sort of like intuition about things. And this intuition is manifest in the sense that he senses danger, right? Maybe there's a predatory animal watching him. Maybe there's another human being waiting to ambush him. He just, to quote Han Solo, has a bad feeling about this and just leaves. Right? Now, he has no observable sense data, no observable data to demonstrate this, but he swears
Mhm.
by it and he lives by it, right? And the other guy doesn't. Well, I think ceteris paribus, we'd all agree that the guy with the aforementioned gift would be, one, justified in believing it. It's a kind of immediate understanding of the situation without having to think about it. And we'd be justified in thinking that it has enhanced his success and livelihood in that profession. And if he were somehow your guide, no one would take it seriously, saying, well, I don't know, can you rationally justify to me this feeling you have about being in the woods? I've never been in the woods my entire life, but I don't know, can you rationally convince me of it? I mean, the guy should just get slapped. I mean, nobody would take that seriously. Another good example would be, let's say you have two men, one who's read everything there is to read on sailing, but never sailed a
Mhm.
ship. Never said. But
Mhm.
then there's another man who has sailed a ship his entire life and speaks in terms of, his spirit is at one with the ship. Every creak and groan he feels intuitively. He's at one with the wind. He can almost preternaturally feel the wind change before it comes. That's actually a theme in The Return of the King, where different individuals perceive a change in the wind leading up to the battle or into the Battle of Pelennor Fields, as well as the currents. Right, he's kind of in this flow state with the ship, the sea, and the winds. And he's developed, cultivated, as well as maybe even having a gift to perceive it, a kind of like mental perception. Which of the two would you have to captain your ship?
Hmm. I mean, given those two personalities that you've described, I'm taking the guy who's been sailing his whole life, for sure.
Right, because there's a kind of knowledge which is being communicated through an experience other than rational thinking, right?
Yeah.
And so we all intuitively know that this is a meaningful way to know something, and that this is true, right? Or there's a famous example where Richard Dawkins was debating a mathematician named Lennox, Lennox, and he said to Dawkins, because Dawkins is all super rational, he's like, well, do you have faith that your wife loves you? And everybody laughs. And then he's like, right, there's ways that she shows it to me. And Lennox is like, yeah, but it's not a rational argument. And everybody kind of laughs at Dawkins' expense, because it's clearly absurd that he's saying the only way you can know something is through rational thinking.
How do you how about cases where you are so much disposed to want to believe something that you ignore enormous quantities of evidence? The evidence is completely overwhelming, and yet it's your emotional thinking that's leading you to the wrong conclusion, and you are actually incorrect. So it's all very well setting up the straw man where the rational thinking is incorrect, but aren't there at least as many, if not more, cases in the real world in which people's lack of rationality is in fact the problem?
Yes, but we also need to make a distinction within the idea of feeling, right? So if we view feeling as a skill or a capacity that is cultivated, uh, trusting it by itself without any sort of training or education is generally bad. Now, again, there are a few exceptional savants who just have it right out of the gate, and they should trust it, and they are justified in trusting it, but most don't, and you have to cultivate it. So there's a saying from, I think it was Francis Bacon: a little philosophy inclineth a man to atheism, but much philosophy inclineth a man to God. The idea being that a little bit of rational learning turns you into the village atheist, but you don't really know what you're doing with it, right? Once you go further in, you see the true depth of the philosophy and how it points to God. I think feeling would be like that too. Once you have some tuning to certain things and you just lean into that right out of the gate, and most times you're probably going to run into trouble because you need to further calibrate and refine it.
Hmm. But then, by the way that you've just described it, actually rational thinking is also a skill and is also important. and so therefore it's not overrated. It's actually correctly rated. It's just occasionally misused.
Well, when we say rational thinking is overrated, this is a kind of open-ended question with not very well delimited. So when I
No.
say when I see this, it sounds like
Yeah.
to me somebody who's a romantic or a poet arguing against a new atheist.
Right. Yeah.
That's how
So
I read that.
so it's the new atheist, the secularist, in fact, who maybe is overrating rational thinking. Do you think the population at large, do you think if you stopped the average man on the street, that he overrates rational thinking?
I think yes and no, right? On the one hand, quote unquote intellectuals are often held by the common man in very high regard because of the illusion that they're actually rationally thinking. Uh, and they might be, but they might not be. And the thing is, you can rationally come to pretty awful conclusions. So right, just because you can do, I mean, maybe your goal is to figure out how to kill as many Japanese in Tokyo as possible. So you build, flame bombs that will maximize destruction. That's rational, but it's not good. But in their own lives, probably not. They probably don't rationally think that much in their own lives.
Is rational thinking the same thing as philosophy?
No, no. I think rational thinking is a act of the will, whereas philosophy is a mindset and a goal where you're oriented towards wisdom. Whereas rational
Mm.
thinking is a kind of what Aristotle would call an efficient cause, the means by which. Whereas philosophy is the telos, the end.
I mean, oriented towards wisdom feels a little question begging because there's plenty of bad philosophy that's oriented towards foolishness.
Well, I mean, it's in the name.
Yeah, fair. So if rational thinking, is this a modern disease? Do you think that how it seems very prevalent in the last 100 years, but has it always been the case through human history that there's been this vaunted place for the rational thinker, the intellect, the intellectual, the academic?
I mean, within Western philosophy, once you have these sort of like cloistered urbanites, the Platonists, the Scholastics, the Enlightenment thinkers, as they are increasingly sheltered from the world around them, they do increasingly prioritize reason as such. But I think the further back you go, though, they would still be aware of the influence of these other things like faith or experience or something like that. It's the idea of rational thinking above all else to the exclusion of all else is definitely more of a modern thing.
I once heard it said that the sign of a flourishing society is having enough spare resources to be able to allow people to sit and do nothing else but think. This is the sign of all the greatest civilizations at their peak, that they employ full-time philosophers. I'm now wondering if it's in fact the opposite. That's the sign of a truly sick society.
Well, there's a saying that Minerva's owl flies at sunset.
Explain that. What's Minerva's owl?
So Minerva is the Roman name for Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and her totemic animal is the owl. And sunset refers to a declining civilization.
Which would imply that both positive things in thought and negative things in culture are happening simultaneously.
Yes.
Interesting. You kind of have this moment of blinding clarity as you're heading off the cliff.
Yes.
All right, let's call this round to an end. But I think you've done again exceptionally well. You're very good at this game. It feels almost tailor-made for you. But I can't bring myself to give a 5 because I don't know. I want to lend myself the headroom. I want to be able to falsely inflate my points over the next several years as we continue to play the game. So I'm going to give you another 4.5 on this round. You ready for your last round?
Last round. Let's go.
Okay. Would you like to talk about God does miracles today? Modern culture is incompatible with Christian values? or the United States is a Christian country?
All of these are pretty spicy, but I'm going to go with modern culture is incompatible with Christian values.
I like that you're maximizing spice. So you picked the US as a Christian country, and would you like to take
No,
the
no, no. I said
affirmative?
modern culture is incompatible with Christian values.
The middle one. Modern culture is incompatible with Christian values. What do you want to do? Positive or negative?
Positive. I agree with the statement.
But I should say these questions are not necessarily phrased to be something that I myself agree or disagree with. And so if I'm pushing back, I'm just taking the contrary position to weed out further argumentation. So go ahead. What makes you think modern culture is incompatible with Christian values?
So again, modern culture is a big sort of open-ended thing. So briefly, I'll just hit a couple highlights with modern culture that I think are problematic. Well, the first of all is, as I've gone piggybacking on Marx was right, modern culture is entirely within the purview of the cash nexus. So everything is to be exchanged. All human social relations, not just economic, but all human social relations are mediated through monetary exchange. So let me give you a good example of this, right? A couple of interesting things have happened with the propaganda around corporate personhood. On the one hand, you have like conservatives and middle class people who almost view corporations as a person. Like when a business starts, they almost treat it like a child being born. And when a business succeeds and grows, they almost view it as someone growing up. But then when the business dies, they almost treat it like a child's dying. It's so bizarre, but I've seen this, and because they've been conditioned to think of it as a person. That's absolutely insane. But I mean, I've seen people who treat the rise and fall of businesses like this. The other thing is, you have the idea that the modern corporation is an LLC, a limited liability corporation, which means that person is really trying to avoid being liable for anything. But because America has this idea of personhood, everybody across the political spectrum has now implicitly treated everybody else as a liability, because I'm an LLC that wants to reduce liability costs to myself. And so I'm going to have to treat you very transactionally, very suspiciously, so that you are not a liability for me. And again, that's just part of the outgrowth of this propagandistic narrative. And for the record, not only leftists but libertarians also, at least in theory, oppose the idea of corporate personhood. And so this leads to all sorts of completely unchristian behavior. Like you can't treat other people, let alone family members and fellow churchgoers, as liabilities to be managed or avoided. Not at all. The other thing we have is Ivan Illich talks about the idea of sort of like standardization of processes. So he gives the parable of the Good Samaritan and says that from the Christian point of view, this is a sort of act of an individual, the Samaritan, to the individual, the Jew, who's injured by the side of the road. And this is a interpersonal relationship based on one man standing towards God, determining how he relates to other people. Whereas if you have these abstract institutions like charities or Social Security or whatever, you're like, I don't have to care for that person. The government will take care of it, or the charity will take care of it, right? Now you've sort of divested yourself as a Christian of having to care for other people because, we got experts to do that, which Illich considers to be a very serious problem, because the actual thrust of the parable of the Good Samaritan is actually undercut by this. I haven't yet talked about this very much yet, though I will more on my channel. We talk about the new Soviet man, but really the new American man is someone whose entire suite of identities are chosen. He has no unchosen identity. But the catch is all these identities he chooses are the result of corporate concepts, which are themselves also manifestations of levels of simulation within technology, to bring in Baudrillard. Now, whereas a Christian, you cannot say that you choose your identity. You can't choose your sex. You can't choose how you relate to other people once you've committed yourself to Christ. I mean, there's just certain normative behaviors you have to the only choice involved is prudence. Like, is this the best way to do this in this context? Not, can I be free not to do it at all? You can't say that either. Or to put it another way, you could say in one sense in the United States we're all libertarians now, right? Because even when the feminist says my body, my choice, even if she's on the far left, that implies self-ownership, right? Because why is it her body? Why does that have that significance? But Paul says, you are not your own. You are purchased with a great price. You in fact don't own yourself. And so, okay, that's a basic assumption of the modern world that is incompatible with Christianity. I mean, there's a lot right there. There's more I could, of course, adduce, but I think modern culture is a very big concept. So we'll cap it here for the moment.
I guess my first question is this list of incompatibilities unique to the current moment? I assume you're going to say no, in which case, is modern culture more incompatible with Christian values than other times and places in history?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no. Okay, because there are certain elements of modern culture that have antecedents in the past, right? So the U.S. empire could be seen as something like the spirit of Babel. We had Egypt, we had Babylon, we had Alexander the Great, we had the Romans, right? This is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time, but the Bible all the way through criticizes this kind of political order. So in that sense, this challenge is a perennial challenge. It's always been there. I guess what makes the challenge different now is we live in these complex simulations that have been really since the late 19th century, when you see how the way we relate to society and each other radically alters. And so there's a sharp break if you look at the last history of the last 200 years versus all of prior history. Or to put it another way, if you grew up in a farm in Iowa in 1900, you had more in common with somebody living in ancient Egypt than you would with somebody today. Because there's been so many changes in our mode of existence, which is the result of technology, which nobody ever had to deal with in the past, which has created a very unique set of challenges. So yes and no.
As slightly an aside from this question, and therefore from the format of this entire stream, but how do you reconcile the significance of technological change with the idea from Ecclesiastes that there is nothing new under the sun, that even what might appear at first to be a new technology is really something that has been before and will be again? So how can you say that the current moment is unique when it seems like the wisdom in the Old Testament gives us a cyclical view of history?
So yeah, when Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun, I think one thing we need to say, in what sense, right? We can talk in terms of, on the one hand, motivations for behavior, right? We're all human. We all have the same motivations throughout history. There's no like, quote, pinnacle of human evolution, unquote, no new Soviet man, unquote, that we can, develop to that will make us qualitatively or fundamentally different than other humans before. Now, is Solomon talking about material conditions, like, developing airplanes? I mean, because that is new. There wasn't airplanes in the Old Testament. So I don't think Solomon here is talking about material conditions per se, but more like in moral motivations, psychological stuff.
It's often said that Islam is a religion that brings a culture in a way that Christianity is not, right? That whereas Christianity can be integrated into existing cultures in a seamless way, Islam has all of these very specific instructions about the legal system and the governmental system and the way that you should dress and so on and so on. So do you see that distinction as valid, or do you think that Christianity properly interpreted would bring just as complete and comprehensive a set of cultural changes to any society that it affects.
Right. So on the one hand, Islam is a lot more like, say, both Torah and rabbinical Judaism, where you have all of these rules that are very specifically laid out.
Yeah.
In which case you have what we might call a constructed culture. But on the other hand, whereas New Testament Christianity seems to give us a more latitude, right? General principles to live by rather than a specific set of rigid guidelines. Now,
Yeah.
part of that could be the case that, yes, Christianity is more open-ended in that way. But I'm going to quote C.S. Lewis here to wrap all this up, because I actually think it does give us a specific view of society. From mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says, all the same, the New Testament, without going into details, gives us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would be like. Perhaps it gives us more than we can take. It tells us that there are to be no passengers or parasites. If a man does not work, he ought not to eat. Everyone is to work with his own hands, and what is more, everyone's work is to produce something good. There will be no manufacture of silly luxuries and then of silly advertisements to persuade us to buy them. And there is to be no swank or side nor putting on airs. So C.S. Lewis at least floats the idea, hypothetically, that the Christian system is actually spelled out. It's just that it's, for whatever reason, maybe it's too rigorous, maybe it's just too hard to implement. People always want to make their own little additions. And they want to be like, well, the parts of the Bible I like, plus my own additions, are the original package. Where it's like, Lewis is like, no. There actually is an original package that if we didn't add human conventions to, would lead to a pretty clear idea of what a Christian society would be like. And I think we don't have very many examples of those in history. I think Lewis would agree, and that's my answer.
Do you think there is a component of culture that is sort of orthogonal to goodness, or can all elements of culture be measured normatively?
So can you?
As in, are there elements of the culture that you could say have absolutely zero moral value one way or another, that this is entirely an arbitrary, or perhaps even an expression of the people who formed the culture in some deep spiritual or genetic way?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, and if I think I understand what you're saying, I would agree. There are concepts which are called adiaphora, which is Greek for indifferent. So we could say that the Bible makes prescriptions, you must do these things, and then prohibitions, you must not do these things. But if you look at all of those, there's still a whole lot of human activity that's not really directly spoken of. Like, for example, where you put your fork and your knife when you're going to eat. Do you flip them? One culture might have the fork on the right hand and the knife on the left, and another nation might flip it. Well, that doesn't fall into either of those two categories and is what we might call adiaphora, indifferent. It doesn't really matter. I don't think there's any sort of moral weight to that, unless you could demonstrate some implicit or explicit connection to some other principle that might be objectionable or not.
Well, I think we'll call this round to an end, and the fact that you got the word adiaphora in there in the end gives you an extra half point. I was going to give you 4, but you've pushed yourself up to what is currently the top score I'm giving out. We'll see. Maybe I'll inflate the score over the years so that people are eventually getting hundreds of points per round, and they'll look back on these earlier shows and say, this is preposterous. These scores are so low to be laughable. We'll see. But yes, that brings you to the end of the Gauntlet. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you for surviving the Gauntlet. And I can announce that your score in total was 18.5. I think I need a sound button so I can have fake applause from the studio audience. You got 4 in the first round, 3 in the second round. And then for the last 3 rounds, you got 4.5 for each one. So a very worthy contestant. Praise of Holly. And do everybody who's watching check out Praise of Holly. I'll make sure I put the links in the description. Anything you'd like to plug in particular that you're up to at the moment?
Well, only this. I mean, you'll have the description in here, but I
Exactly.
recently started writing for my Substack again. Some life stuff got in the way. Couldn't really chip away at it, plug away at it, but I feel like I'll be able to begin regular contributions to Substack again. So check that out.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Pleasure.